The lamplight flickered against her face as Clara Whitmore set another metal letter into the composing stick, her ink-stained fingers moving with practiced precision, even as exhaustion pressed heavy against her shoulders. The printing press stood silent in the corner of the small adobe building, waiting for dawn when she would finally have enough pages ready to run the week's edition of the Naco Sentinel, the only newspaper in this dusty Arizona border town that had sprung up along the railroad tracks in 1897. She had been 21 when her father died 2 years ago, leaving her the press and a promise that the truth mattered more than comfort. Her mother had passed during childbirth when Clara was just a girl, and her father had raised her among the smell of ink and paper, teaching her to set type before she could properly read. Now, at 23, she ran the paper alone, writing every article, setting every letter, cranking the press until her arms ached, and delivering papers to the mercantile, saloon, and post office before most people had finished their morning coffee. The lamp oil was running low again. She glanced at the nearly empty bottle on the shelf and felt that familiar tightness in her chest. Everything was running low. Paper, ink, lamp oil, the small savings her father had left her. The merchants in town paid little for advertising, and most folks thought a woman had no business running a newspaper anyway. They expected her to fail, to sell the press, and find a husband like a proper lady should. Clara pushed a strand of dark hair from her face and kept working. The story she was setting told of water rights disputes between the ranchers north of town, dry prose that probably interested no one but the men involved. Still, it mattered. Truth mattered. Her father had believed that, and she did too. The door opened, letting in the cool April night air and the sound of distant music from the saloon down the street. Clara looked up, startled. Few people visited the newspaper office, and never this late. The man who stepped inside had to duck slightly beneath the doorframe. He was tall and lean, wearing dust-covered boots, denim trousers, and a shirt that had once been white but now showed the stains of hard travel. A hat shadowed his face until he removed it, revealing sun-weathered features, eyes the color of creek water, and hair that needed cutting. He looked to be in his mid-20s, and something about the way he moved suggested a man comfortable with long days in the saddle. "We are closed," Clara said, setting down her composing stick. "If you want to place an advertisement, you can return tomorrow after 9. "I am not here for an advertisement." His voice was low and steady. "I am here because I saw your light burning. It has been burning every night for the past week when I ride through town." Clara bristled. "My work habits are not your concern. You are Clara Whitmore." It was not a question. "I am, and you are, Caleb Granger. I work cattle for the Double C Ranch about 10 miles north." He turned his hat in his hands, and Clara noticed his fingers were calloused and strong. "I read your paper, every week. You wrote about the fence cutters last month, and the story helped us figure out who was responsible. You wrote about the drought conditions and which wells were still running clean. You wrote about the school teacher who needed books, and folks donated. Your paper matters, Miss Whitmore." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, surprised by the praise. "Thank you, Mr. Granger. That is kind of you to say. It is not kindness. It is truth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag that clinked with the sound of coins. "I noticed you were low on lamp oil last week. The bottle on your shelf was nearly empty then too. And I heard talk at the mercantile that you have been buying supplies on credit because the paper is not bringing in enough money." Clara's embarrassment turned to anger. "My financial situation is definitely not your concern." "Maybe not." Caleb stepped forward and placed the bag on her work table. "But I figure if you cannot afford lamp oil, you probably cannot afford ink either, And if you run out of ink, the town loses its only newspaper." She stared at the bag, then at him. "I cannot accept charity. It is not charity. It is an investment." His creek water eyes held her steadily. "I am investing in the truth, in the only person in this town brave enough to print it." "Why?" The question came out softer than she intended. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, "My father could not read. He worked cattle his whole life, trusted the wrong people, signed contracts he could not understand. They took his land, his herd, everything. He died believing he was just stupid, that it was his own fault. But it was not. He just did not have access to information, to truth, to someone willing to explain things in plain language." He gestured toward the press. "You do that. Every week. You write so regular folks can understand. You explain the water rights and the land laws and the railroad schedules. You give people the information they need to protect themselves." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lamp. "I am sorry about your father." "Me too." Caleb put his hat back on. "Use the money for ink, or lamp oil, or paper. Whatever you need to keep printing, I will bring more next month." "Mr. Granger, I cannot." "Yes, you can." He moved toward the door, then paused. "And Miss Whitmore, you should not work so late every night. This is not the safest town after dark. I have a gun." "I am sure you do. But even so." He tipped his hat to her and stepped out into the night, leaving Clara alone with her composing stick, her flickering lamp, and a bag of coins that felt heavier than it should. She sat down slowly, pulled the bag toward her, and opened it. There was enough money for a month's worth of supplies, maybe more. Her throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She had been so close to giving up, so close to admitting defeat. This stranger, this cowboy who worked cattle for the Double C Ranch, had given her a lifeline without asking for anything in return. Clara wiped her eyes, took a steadying breath, and went back to work. The story about water rights was not going to set itself, and she had a paper to print by morning. Over the following weeks, Caleb Granger became a regular presence in her life, though she did not see him often. Every few days she would find something waiting at her door in the early morning. A bottle of lamp oil, a package of paper from the mercantile, once even a basket of food from the hotel restaurant. There was never a note, but she knew who left them. She tried to refuse the gifts. She left them untouched for a day, determined to remain independent. But then her lamp would start to sputter as the oil ran dry, or she would realize she only had enough paper for one more edition, and practicality would win over pride. She used what Caleb brought, and she kept printing the paper. In early May, she was working on a story about a dispute between the railroad and local landowners when Caleb walked into the office during daylight hours for the first time since that initial night. He was cleaner than before, his shirt freshly washed, his hair trimmed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Granger." Clara set down her pen. "I have been meaning to speak with you about the supplies you keep leaving. Are they the wrong kind? I can get different. They are perfect, and that is the problem." She stood up, brushing ink from her fingers with a rag. "I appreciate your help more than I can express, but I need to pay you back. I cannot keep accepting gifts. They are not gifts. I told you they are investments. Then I am your business partner, and business partners keep accounts." She pulled out a ledger and showed him the careful notations she had been making. "I have recorded everything you have provided and its estimated value. Once the paper starts making more money, I will repay you." Caleb looked at the ledger, then at her. Something in his expression softened. "You are stubborn. I am independent. There is a difference." "I am starting to see that." He smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less weathered. "How about a deal then? I will keep supplying ink and paper and whatever else you need." In exchange, you teach me to read better. Clara blinked. You can read. You said you read the paper every week. I can read enough to get by. Simple words, short sentences. But the legal notices, the more complicated stories, I have to work through them slow, and sometimes I get lost. My father could not read at all, but I at least learned the basics at a mining camp school when I was young. I want to read better. I want to understand everything. She studied him, this cowboy who had appeared in her life like an answer to an unspoken prayer. You want to trade supplies for reading lessons, seems fair to me. You need supplies. I need education. We help each other. Clara considered it. The arrangement would let her keep her pride while still accepting his help, and teaching him to read better would be easy enough, even enjoyable. She liked the idea of helping him the way he had helped her. All right, she said. We have a deal. They shook hands, and Clara was acutely aware of how her small palm fit into his larger, calloused one. The touch lingered a moment longer than necessary before they both pulled away. When do we start? Caleb asked. Tonight, if you are available. I usually work late anyway, and the office is quiet then. So it began. 3 evenings a week. After Caleb finished his work at the ranch, he would ride into Naco and spend 2 hours at the newspaper office while Clara taught him to read. They started with the basics, working through difficult words and complex sentences. She would give him passages from her articles to practice, and he would sound out the words carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge in a way that touched her heart. He asked questions about everything: why certain words were spelled strangely, what the legal jargon meant, how she decided what stories to write. Their lessons gradually evolved into longer conversations about the town, the territory, politics, and life. Clara learned that Caleb had been born in Texas, that he had worked cattle since he was 14, that his mother had died of fever when he was young, and his father had raised him alone until passing away 3 years ago. He had drifted for a while, working different ranches, until he found steady work at the Double C. Caleb learned that Clara had been helping her father with the paper since she was 8 years old, that she loved the smell of ink and the sound of the press, that she sometimes felt lonely but never regretted choosing this life. Her father had taught her that words had power, that telling the truth was a form of courage, and she carried that belief like a torch. As May turned to June, and the Arizona heat intensified, something shifted between them. Their hands would brush when passing papers back and forth. Their eyes would meet and hold for a beat too long. The air in the small office seemed to grow thicker, charged with something neither of them spoke aloud. One evening in late June, as the sun set in streaks of orange and red outside the window, Caleb looked up from the passage he was reading and said, "Why did you never marry?" The question surprised her. "That is rather personal. Sorry, you do not have to answer," but Clara found she wanted to. No one ever asked. Or rather, the men who asked were not men I could respect. They wanted a wife to cook and clean and bear children. They did not want a partner. They certainly did not want a woman who ran a newspaper and had ink under her fingernails. She paused. "What about you?" "Why has no woman claimed you yet?" Caleb smiled slightly. "I never stayed in one place long enough, and I never met anyone who made me want to stay." He looked at her steadily. "Until now," Clara's breath caught. The lamplight flickered between them, casting shadows on the walls. "Caleb." "I know this started as a business arrangement," he said quietly. "You needed supplies. I needed lessons. But it has become more than that, at least for me. These evenings with you are the best part of my days. I find myself looking for excuses to come to town, hoping I might see you. And when I am at the ranch, I think about what you might be writing, what story you might be working on." She should stop him. She should maintain the professional boundary between them, but her heart was hammering in her chest, and all she could think was that she felt the same way. "I think about you too," she admitted. "When I am setting type, I wonder what you would think of the story. When something interesting happens, I want to tell you about it. I find myself listening for your footsteps outside the door." Caleb stood up slowly, moving around the work table until he was standing in front of her. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Clara Whitmore, may I court you properly?" "Properly." A smile tugged at her lips. "What does that mean?" "It means I would like to take you to dinner at the hotel. I would like to walk with you in the evening when it cools down. I would like everyone in this town to know that I am trying to win your heart, if you will let me try." Clara's heart felt too big for her chest. "You do not need to try, Caleb. You already have it." He reached up and cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Then may I kiss you?" "Yes." He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. Clara's eyes closed and she melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel his heart beating hard beneath her palms, as rapid as her own. The kiss deepened, and Clara felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to leave. "It is getting late and people will talk if they see my horse outside your office much longer. Let them talk." But Clara knew he was right. For all that she did not care much what people thought, she did not want to give them ammunition to use against her paper. Caleb kissed her once more, quick and sweet, then stepped back. "I will see you tomorrow evening." "Yes, and Caleb, thank you for the ink, for all of it. Thank you for the reading lessons, and for everything else." After he left, Clara stood in the quiet office, touching her lips and smiling like a fool. The composing stick waited on the table, the story half finished, but for once she did not mind the interruption. Some things were more important than deadlines. True to his word, Caleb courted her properly. He took her to dinner at the hotel, where the dining room full of ranchers and railroad men watched with undisguised curiosity. He walked with her in the evenings, offering his arm and telling her stories about the ranch that made her laugh. He came to her reading lessons every week, working diligently through increasingly complex passages until he could read anything she put in front of him. The town buzzed with gossip. Clara Whitmore and Caleb Granger were courting, and people did not know what to make of it. Some approved, saying Clara needed a strong man to take care of her. Others disapproved, whispering that she would give up the paper now, that she would become a proper wife and abandon her strange career. Clara ignored them all and kept printing the paper. If anything, she worked harder than ever, determined to prove that she could be both a journalist and a woman in love. In July, tensions in Naco escalated. A group of land speculators from back east had been buying up property around the town, making promises they did not keep and squeezing out longtime residents. Clara wrote a series of articles exposing their tactics, naming names and citing specific cases of fraud. The speculators were not pleased. One afternoon, 3 men in expensive suits came to the newspaper office. The leader, a man named Howard Fletcher with oiled hair and cold eyes, leaned against her work table. "Miss Whitmore, your recent articles have been troubling." Clara stood up straight, meeting his gaze. "They have been truthful. If you find truth troubling, perhaps you should reconsider your business practices." "Careful, little lady, you are making dangerous accusations." "They are not accusations. They are documented facts. I have spoken to the families you have defrauded. I have copies of the contracts you tricked them into signing." Fletcher's face hardened. "You need to print a retraction. Say you made errors, that you misunderstood the situation." "I will not lie." "Then we will make sure you cannot print anything at all." He gestured around the office. Printing presses are expensive. So are windows and doors. It would be a shame if something happened to yours. Clara's hand moved toward the drawer where she kept her father's revolver, but one of Fletcher's companions noticed and shook his head in warning. Think about it, Miss Whitmore. Print the retraction, or face the consequences. Fletcher tipped his hat mockingly and left with his men. Clara's hands were shaking. She sat down hard in her chair, trying to steady her breathing. She was frightened but also furious. These men thought they could threaten her into silence. They thought she would back down because she was a woman, because she was alone. But she was not alone. Not anymore. That evening she told Caleb what had happened. They were sitting in the office after his reading lesson, and she tried to downplay it, but he saw through her immediately. They threatened you. His voice was dangerously quiet. They threatened the paper. Same thing. Caleb stood up, pacing. You need protection. I have my gun. Clara, these are not small-time troublemakers. These are wealthy men with hired guns. He turned to her, his face set with determination. I am staying in town until this is resolved. You cannot abandon your work at the ranch. I will take a leave. The foreman will understand. He knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands. I am not going to let anything happen to you or your paper. We will figure this out together. She wanted to argue, to insist she could handle it herself. But the truth was she was scared, and having Caleb there made her feel safer. Together, she agreed. Caleb moved into the small room behind the print shop that Clara's father had once used for storage. He made arrangements with the ranch, explaining he needed time to handle a personal matter. The foreman, who read the Sentinel every week, understood immediately and told Caleb to take all the time he needed. For the next week, Caleb stayed close. He walked Clara to the mercantile when she bought supplies. He sat in the office while she worked, reading books he borrowed from the schoolteacher and keeping watch. At night, he slept in the back room with his gun within reach. Clara did not print a retraction. Instead, she printed another article with even more detailed evidence of the speculator's fraud. She cited Arizona territorial law, quoted legal experts, and called for an investigation. The article was her best work, clear and devastating. The day the paper came out, Fletcher returned. This time he brought 6 men with him, all wearing gun belts. They entered the office like a storm, and Fletcher's face was twisted with rage. You stupid woman, he snarled. I gave you a chance. Caleb stepped out from the back room, his own gun drawn. I think you gentlemen should leave. Fletcher's men reached for their weapons, but Caleb was faster. He fired once into the ceiling, the shot deafening in the small space. The next one will not be a warning. Get out. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then the door opened again, and more men filed in. Clara recognized them. Ranchers from north of town, merchants from the main street, even the schoolteacher and the minister. They were all armed, and they all looked furious. We read the paper, said Tom Davidson, who owned the general store. We know what you have been doing, Fletcher. And we are not going to let you hurt Miss Whitmore or shut down the Sentinel. Fletcher looked around at the assembled townspeople and seemed to realize he was outnumbered. His face went red, but he forced a smile. This is not over. Yes, it is, Caleb said. You are going to leave Naco and never come back, and you are going to return the land you stole, or we will make sure the territorial authorities know every detail of what you have done. Fletcher's eyes darted between Caleb and the armed townspeople. Finally, he jerked his head at his men. Let us go. They left, and Clara released a breath she had not realized she was holding. The townspeople crowded around her, offering support and promising to keep watch. She thanked them, overwhelmed by the solidarity, by the proof that her work mattered to people. After everyone left, she turned to Caleb. You saved the paper. We saved it. You saved it by being brave enough to write the truth in the first place. I just made sure you stayed safe while doing it." Clara threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. He held her tight, and she felt the tension of the past week drain away. "I love you," she said, the words muffled against his shirt. "I love you, Caleb Granger." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "I love you too, Clara Whitmore. I have loved you since that first night when I saw you working by lamplight, determined and fierce and beautiful." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Clara felt like she had come home. The speculators left Naco within the week, their schemes exposed and their reputations ruined. The territorial authorities did launch an investigation based on Clara's articles, and several of the men faced charges. The families who had been defrauded got their land back, and the story was picked up by newspapers in Tucson and Phoenix, bringing attention to Clara's work. In August, Caleb asked Clara to marry him. They were sitting on the steps of the newspaper office in the evening, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. He did not make a grand speech or drop to one knee. He simply took her hand and said, "Marry me, Clara. Let me spend my life helping you print the truth. Let me bring you ink so you never have to stop." She said yes without hesitation. They were married in September at the small church in Naco, with half the town in attendance. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue calico, and Caleb wore his best suit. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Caleb kissed his bride, the townspeople cheered. Clara did not give up the paper. She had feared that Caleb might expect her to, that marriage would mean the end of her career. But he never suggested such a thing. Instead, he became her partner in every sense. He learned the printing press, took over deliveries, and even started writing occasional articles about ranch life and cattle prices. They lived in the rooms behind the newspaper office, small and cramped but perfect for them. Every night they worked side by lamplight, Clara setting type and Caleb preparing the press. Every morning they delivered papers together, greeting the townspeople as a team. In October, Clara realized she was pregnant. She told Caleb over dinner, nervous about how he would react. Would he want her to stop working? Would he worry about her health? But Caleb's face lit up with joy. "A baby, we are going to have a baby. Yes, in the spring, I think." He pulled her into his arms, laughing and spinning her around despite the cramped space. "This is wonderful, the best news." "I want to keep working," Clara said quickly. "As long as I can, the paper will be fine," Caleb finished. "We will figure it out together. We always do." The winter was mild by Arizona standards, and Clara worked through most of her pregnancy. As her belly grew, Caleb took on more of the physical work, cranking the press and hauling bundles of papers. He was protective but not overbearing, understanding that Clara needed to work, that the paper was part of who she was. Their daughter was born on a warm April evening in 1899, delivered by the doctor's wife in the back room of the newspaper office. They named her Margaret, after Clara's mother, and called her Maggie. She was tiny and perfect, with Clara's dark hair and Caleb's creek water eyes. Clara took a few weeks off after the birth, the first real break she had taken in years. The paper went on hiatus, and the town complained good-naturedly about missing their weekly news. But everyone understood, and they sent gifts: baby clothes, blankets, food for the new parents. When Clara returned to work, she did so with Maggie in a cradle beside the printing press. The baby would sleep while Clara wrote and set type, and when she woke, Clara would nurse her and then get back to work. It was exhausting, but Clara had never been happier. Caleb proved to be a devoted father. He would rush back from the ranch in the evenings to hold his daughter, singing her songs he remembered from his own childhood. He would walk her around the office when she was fussy, his large hands cradling her tiny body with infinite gentleness. As Maggie grew from infant to toddler, the newspaper thrived. Clara's reputation had spread beyond Naco after the land speculation scandal, and she started receiving correspondence from other journalists and editors. Some newspapers began reprinting her articles with permission, and she even sold a few pieces to a magazine in San Francisco. The money situation eased considerably. Between the newspaper income, Caleb's wages from the ranch, and Clara's freelance writing, they were comfortable for the first time. They expanded the office, adding a proper living space and a second room for Maggie. They bought new equipment for the paper and even hired a young man to help with deliveries. In the summer of 1901, when Maggie was 2 and toddling everywhere on unsteady legs, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 boys born in the winter of 1902. They named them William and Thomas, and suddenly the household was chaos. Caleb reduced his hours at the ranch, working closer to home so he could help with the children. Clara learned to write articles with a baby on each hip and a toddler pulling at her skirt. The newspaper office became a family business in the truest sense, with children underfoot and laughter mixing with the clack of the press. The years passed in a blur of ink-stained fingers and dirty diapers, deadlines and first words, late nights at the press and early mornings with crying babies. It was hard work, the hardest Clara had ever done, but she would not have traded it for anything. As the new century progressed, Naco grew from a dusty border town into a proper settlement. The railroad brought more people and more commerce. New businesses opened, and the town needed its newspaper more than ever. The Sentinel remained the voice of the community, chronicling births and deaths, reporting on town meetings and territorial politics, celebrating achievements and exposing corruption. Clara's children grew up in the newspaper office. Maggie learned to set type before she learned to read, mimicking her mother's careful movements. The twins were messier, more interested in the mechanical aspects of the press, taking it apart and putting it back together with Caleb's patient guidance. In 1905, when Maggie was 6 and the twins were 3, Caleb came home one evening with news. The owner of the Double C Ranch was retiring, and he had offered to sell the property to Caleb at a fair price. It was a huge opportunity, a chance to own land and build something permanent. Clara knew how much it meant to him. His father had lost his ranch, and Caleb had worked his whole life with the dream of owning land again. But the ranch was 10 miles out of town, and Clara's newspaper was here. "What do you want to do?" Caleb asked, sitting beside her on the porch while the children played in the yard. "It is your dream," Clara said. "We should do it. But the paper will survive. We can figure it out." She took his hand. "You have spent years helping me build my dream. Let me help you build yours." They talked long into the night, working through possibilities. Finally, they decided on a compromise. They would buy the ranch but keep the newspaper office in town. Caleb would run the ranch with hired help, and Clara would continue printing the paper. They would split their time between the 2 places, managing both the ranch and the newspaper as a family. It was not easy. Clara spent 3 days a week in town, staying at the office and working on the paper. The other days she was at the ranch with Caleb and the children. When she was in town, Caleb managed the children at the ranch with help from a housekeeper. When she was at the ranch, the young man they had hired handled deliveries and took messages for the paper. The arrangement was exhausting, but it worked. The Double C Ranch flourished under Caleb's management, and the Sentinel continued to be Naco's voice. The children thrived, growing strong and healthy in the Arizona sun. By 1908, when Maggie was 9 and the twins were 6, The family had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Maggie was showing a talent for writing and had started contributing small articles to the paper about school events. The twins were more interested in ranching, following their father everywhere and learning about cattle and horses. One evening in the spring of that year, Clara was working late at the newspaper office in town. She had stayed to finish a complicated story about irrigation rights, and the lamplight burned low as she set the final letters. The door opened and Caleb walked in, dusty from the trail. "You came all the way to town this late?" Clara asked, surprised. "I wanted to see you." "And I brought you something." He set a large crate on the table. Clara opened it and gasped. Inside were dozens of bottles of ink enough to last months. "Caleb, this is too much." "No such thing as too much ink." He smiled, the same smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. "I made you a promise, remember? I would bring you ink so you would never have to stop." She stood up and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You know I love you, right? More than anything except our children." "I know, and I love you." The fierce, stubborn, brilliant woman who prints this town's only paper by lamplight. He kissed the top of her head. "Come home tomorrow. The children miss you and I miss you, and the story can wait one more day." "All right," Clara agreed, feeling a wave of contentment wash over her. One more day. They stood together in the quiet office, surrounded by the tools of her trade, the printing press, the cases of metal type, the stacks of paper. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows long across the walls. Outside, the town of Naco slept, unaware that its newspaper would keep telling their stories, that Clara Whitmore Granger would keep seeking truth and printing it for anyone who wanted to read. And she would never run out of ink, because Caleb would make sure of it. He had given her that promise years ago, and he kept it faithfully, just as he kept all his promises to her. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. In 1910, Arizona moved closer to statehood, and Clara covered the political developments with keen interest. She wrote editorials arguing for women's suffrage, scandalizing some readers and inspiring others. Caleb supported her fully, even when neighbors criticized him for allowing his wife such strong opinions. "You are not allowing me anything," Clara would say with a smile. "I have always had opinions." "You just fell in love with a woman who had them." "True enough," he would reply, pulling her close. "And I would not change a single thing about you." Maggie grew into a serious young woman with her mother's passion for journalism. At 14, she was writing full articles for the paper and talking about attending university to study writing. The twins, now 12, were pure cowboys at heart, happiest on horseback chasing cattle across the rangeland. In 1912, Arizona finally achieved statehood, and Clara printed a special edition of the Sentinel celebrating the occasion. She wrote about the territory's history, the challenges ahead, and the hope she felt for the future. Copies of that edition were kept by families all over the region as a memento of the historic moment. That same year, Caleb and Clara celebrated 15 years of marriage. They threw a party at the ranch, inviting friends from all over the county. As the sun set and musicians played, Caleb took Clara's hand and led her away from the crowd to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. 15 years, he said. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. Forever in a good way, Clara asked. In the best way. He pulled a small package from his pocket. "I got you something." Inside was a silver pen, beautifully crafted with her initials engraved on the side. Clara's breath caught. "Caleb, it is beautiful. For all the stories you have not written yet, all the truth you have not told yet." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you for letting me be part of your life, Clara, for letting me help you do what you were born to do." Tears filled her eyes. "Thank you for buying ink so I never had to stop, for believing in me when no one else did, for being my partner in everything." They stood together as the stars came out, the sounds of the party drifting on the wind. Clara thought back to that night so many years ago when a dusty cowboy had walked into her newspaper office and changed her life forever. She thought about all the editions of the Sentinel they had printed together, all the truths they had told, all the battles they had fought side by side. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked. "How lucky I am. How perfect this life is, even with all its challenges." "Me too," he said, and kissed her as the first stars appeared above the Arizona desert. The years rolled on. Maggie went to university in California, studying journalism and returning home with new ideas and modern techniques. She eventually took over more of the newspaper work, allowing Clara to reduce her hours while still remaining involved. The twins stayed at the ranch, partnering with their father to expand the operation and improve the herds. In 1920, when Clara was 43 and Caleb was 45, they became grandparents for the first time. Maggie married a fellow journalist and had a daughter they named Clara in honor of her grandmother. Clara held her namesake and felt the circle of life completing itself beautifully. More grandchildren followed over the years. The twins both married and had families, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter. Sunday dinners became grand affairs with 3 generations gathered around the long table, sharing stories and making memories. Clara continued to write for the Sentinel, even as Maggie took on more editorial duties. She focused on longer investigative pieces, tackling corruption and injustice with the same passion she had always had. Her reputation extended far beyond Naco now. She was respected throughout Arizona and the Southwest as one of the pioneering women in journalism. Caleb remained her constant support, her partner, her love. He still brought her ink, though now it was more symbolic than necessary. The newspaper was financially stable, even profitable, but he continued the tradition because it mattered to both of them. It was a reminder of how they had started, of the faith he had shown in her when she most needed it. In 1925, the town of Naco held a celebration in honor of the Sentinel's 30th anniversary. The mayor gave a speech praising Clara's decades of service to the community. Former territorial governors and state officials sent letters of congratulation. A plaque was unveiled outside the newspaper office, commemorating Clara's contributions to Arizona journalism. Clara stood beside Caleb during the ceremony, holding his hand tight. "I could not have done any of this without you," she whispered. "Yes, you could have," he whispered back. "But I am glad you did not have to." They were in their late 40s now, their hair showing gray, their faces lined with the evidence of hard work and good years. But when they looked at each other, Clara still saw the young cowboy who had walked into her office with a bag of coins and a promise. And Caleb still saw the determined young woman setting type by lamplight, refusing to give up on truth. The newspaper office had changed over the decades. They had modernized equipment, expanded the building, hired a small staff. But Clara's desk remained in the same spot, and the original printing press her father had used still stood in the corner, a relic now but too precious to discard. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Clara would go to the office alone and sit at that desk, running her fingers over the worn wood. She would think about her father and the legacy he had left her. She would think about that first night when she had been so close to giving up, when the lamp oil was almost gone and hope was fading. She would think about Caleb appearing like a miracle, offering help without strings, believing in her when she had barely believed in herself. Those memories were precious, the foundation of everything she had built. The newspaper, the family, the life, all of it had grown from that moment when a cowboy had said, "I am investing in the truth." By the early 1930s, Clara was in her mid-50s and thinking about retirement. Her children were grown, her grandchildren were thriving, and Maggie was more than capable of running the Sentinel. It was time to let go, to trust the next generation. But letting go was harder than she expected. The newspaper had been her identity for so long that she did not quite know who she was without it. Caleb recognized her struggle and suggested a solution. "Write a book," he said one evening as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Tell your story. Tell our story. All those years of printing other people's news, maybe it is time to tell your own." Clara considered it. A memoir, perhaps, or a history of early Arizona journalism. The idea appealed to her, giving her a new project without the weekly deadline pressure of the newspaper. "I think I will," she said, "but only if you help me remember the details." "I remember everything," Caleb said. "Every moment with you is burned into my memory." So Clara began writing her book, a memoir that was part love story, part history of frontier journalism, part celebration of a life well lived. She wrote about growing up in a newspaper office, about losing her father, about nearly losing the paper itself. She wrote about the night Caleb walked through her door and changed everything. She wrote about their courtship, their marriage, their children, the challenges they had overcome together. Caleb read each chapter as she finished it, offering memories and perspectives she had forgotten or never known. Their children and grandchildren contributed stories too, creating a rich tapestry of family history. The book was published in 1935 by a small press in Phoenix. It did not become a bestseller, but it found its audience among historians, journalists, and anyone interested in the early days of Arizona statehood. Libraries throughout the Southwest added it to their collections. Journalism schools used excerpts in their classes. For Clara, the greatest satisfaction was not the public recognition but the private accomplishment. She had told her truth, preserved her memories, created something her grandchildren and great-grandchildren could read to understand where they came from. In 1940, Clara and Caleb celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary. The celebration was quiet, just the two of them at the ranch house with a simple dinner and a bottle of wine. Their children wanted to throw a party, but Clara and Caleb preferred this intimacy, this chance to reflect on the years together. 41 years, Clara said, leaning against Caleb's shoulder on the porch swing. "More than half my life." "The best half," Caleb said. "Well, the second best." "The best part is still coming," Clara laughed. "You old romantic. What makes you think the best part is still ahead?" "Because I am still with you. As long as we are together, the best part is always ahead." She tilted her face up and kissed him, soft and sweet. After all these years, his kisses still made her heart race. After all these years, she still felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They talked late into the night, remembering everything. The night they met, the reading lessons, the land speculators and the townspeople who had stood with them. Their wedding day, the births of their children, the growth of the ranch and the newspaper, the fights and reconciliations, the triumphs and setbacks, all the small moments that had woven together into a beautiful life. "I would not change anything," Clara said as the stars wheeled overhead. "Every choice, every challenge, every moment led us here, and here is perfect." "Here is perfect," Caleb agreed. "You are perfect. I am not perfect. I am stubborn and opinionated and I work too hard." "Exactly, perfect." Clara smiled and settled closer to him, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong. The night was cool and quiet, the desert wind whispering through the sage. Somewhere in Naco, the Sentinel was being prepared for tomorrow's printing. Maggie would be there, carrying on the tradition, telling the truth in her own voice. The ink would never run out. The stories would never stop. And Clara could rest easy knowing that the work she and Caleb had started would continue long after them. The years that followed were gentle ones. Clara and Caleb lived quietly at the ranch, surrounded by family. Clara still wrote occasional pieces for the Sentinel, but mostly she gardened, read, and spent time with her grandchildren. Caleb managed the ranch with his sons, though he left more and more of the daily work to the younger generation. They were in their 60s now, slowing down but still strong, still devoted to each other. Friends would remark on how they still held hands, still looked at each other with obvious love. After 4 decades together, they remained as connected as newlyweds. In the spring of 1945, as World War II ended and the nation celebrated, Clara received a letter from the Arizona Historical Society. They wanted to interview her for an oral history project, preserving the stories of Arizona pioneers before they were lost to time. Clara agreed, and a young historian came to the ranch with recording equipment. For hours, Clara talked about the early days of NACO, the challenges of running a frontier newspaper, the evolution of Arizona from territory to state. She talked about her father and his commitment to truth. She talked about the land speculators and the townspeople who had defended her. And she talked about Caleb, the cowboy who had walked into her life and given her everything she needed to succeed. The historian asked if he could interview Caleb too, and Caleb agreed, though he insisted he was not interesting. "I just loved my wife," he told the historian. "And I tried to help her do what she was meant to do. That is the whole story." Sometimes, the historian said, the simplest stories are the most profound. The interviews were transcribed and placed in the Historical Society's archives, where they remain to this day. Researchers studying early Arizona journalism inevitably encounter Clara's story, and they learn about the partnership that made it possible. By the late 1940s, Clara and Caleb were in their 70s, slowing down but still together, still in love. Their children were middle-aged now, with grandchildren of their own. The great-grandchildren were starting to arrive, and the family tree had grown large and complex. The Sentinel was still publishing weekly, now run by Maggie's daughter who had inherited the family passion for journalism. The ranch was prosperous, managed by the twins and their sons. The legacy Clara and Caleb had built together was thriving. On a warm evening in the summer of 1950, Clara and Caleb sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains they had watched together for more than 50 years. Clara was 73, Caleb was 75, and they were holding hands as they always did. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Clara asked. "I remember everything," Caleb said. "I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive to have won your heart. I remember thinking the same thing, that I was the luckiest woman alive." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the desert evening. Somewhere inside the house, their great-grandchildren were playing, their laughter drifting through the open windows. In Naco, the newspaper office was probably dark now, but tomorrow it would light up again and the press would run and the truth would be told. "We did good, did we not?" Clara said softly. "We did better than good," Caleb replied. "We built something that mattered. We raised a family. We loved each other well. That is all anyone can hope for." Clara squeezed his hand, feeling the strength still in his grip despite his age. "Thank you for buying me ink all those years ago. Thank you for letting me." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for everything, Clara. For every day, every moment. For this life we built together." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. Her life had been full and rich and meaningful. She had told stories that mattered, loved a man who was worthy of that love, raised children who made her proud. She had fought battles and won some and lost some, but always she had persevered. And through it all, Caleb had been there, bringing her ink, supporting her dreams, loving her unconditionally. He had kept his promise from that very first night. He had made sure she never had to stop. They sat together on the porch as the night deepened. Two people who had chosen each other and never regretted it, who had built a life of purpose and love, who had proven that the most powerful stories are the ones we live ourselves. The lamp in the window glowed softly, casting light into the gathering darkness. It was a fitting symbol for their life together, two people creating light in the wilderness, refusing to let that light go out, sharing it with everyone who needed to see. And the ink never ran out. Not in all the years that followed, not even after Clara and Caleb were both gone and their story became history. Because they had built something permanent, something that could not be erased or forgotten. They had built truth and love, and those things endure forever.